In a society that prides itself on its moral values and compassion, darkness sometimes lurks beneath the brightest light. It lurks beneath the perfect facade, behind friendly smiles and compassionate words. This is the Grove Park neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia. Predominantly African-American community, vibrant yet economically challenged, where children study, play, and trust the adults who guide them. But on a sweltering September afternoon, that trust is brutally betrayed, leaving an indelible scar in the hearts of everyone. Michael Rodriguez, a 9-year-old boy with bright eyes and a radiant smile, left school and never returned home. A desperate cry for help from his Latino immigrant family seemed to hit an invisible wall. Why was the police so appallingly indifferent? Why were his mother's desperate pleas ignored, dismissed as a community internal problem? Meanwhile, the spotlight shines on a perfect character, Mr. Arthur Sullivan, Michael's 4th grade homeroom teacher, a respected white man known for his dedication and exemplary behavior. Who would have thought that behind that trustworthy exterior, there lurks a twisted soul, a terrifying secret that is enough to make you shiver? This is more than a missing persons case. It is an indictment of a system that refuses to see, that refuses to listen. We uncover the chilling truth of racial prejudice ingrained in the legal system, deadly police failures, and the specter of a psychopath who exploits those same vulnerabilities to wreak havoc. Can justice ever be served when the truth is obscured by indifference and hatred? Join us as we explore one of the most haunting cases, where anger and fear collide, revealing a horrifying truth about the cost of injustice. A story that gets darker the deeper you delve, and you will find yourself caught between a vortex of suspense and an uncontrollable rage. Part 1. Dark Dawn and the Silent Cry in Grove Park. The afternoon of the 22nd of September, 2024, was a still sweltering autumn day in Atlanta, Georgia. The maple leaves were beginning to turn yellow, but the air was heavy and gloomy. Around 3:30 p.m., when the bell rang at Grove Park High School, signaling the end of a normal school day, the laughter of students filled the schoolyard. But among the crowd, one boy did not go home. Michael Rodriguez, 9, a bright, alert 4th grader with curly black hair and big round eyes, did not appear at the school gates as usual, where his mother, Maria Rodriguez, was patiently waiting. Maria, a Latina immigrant mother, worked hard to support her 2 children in Grove Park, a predominantly African-American community with modest incomes. A sense of unease rose within her as time passed without a trace of Michael. She called the school, Michael's friends, but no one knew where he was. Panic began to rise inside her like a tidal wave. Around 6 p.m., Maria, sobbing and speaking broken English, called 911. "My son, Michael, didn't come home from school," she stammered. The operator, in a monotone, professional but lacking in urgency, asked for information several times. Maria tried to explain that Michael never went anywhere alone, especially not at school. "He's a good boy, ma'am. Never. Something's wrong," she pleaded. But her voice, laced with panic and the language barrier, didn't seem to be taken with the seriousness it deserved. It had only been a few minutes, but those minutes could have been the beginning of a series of fateful mistakes, a series of mistakes that would cost an innocent life. When the Atlanta Police Department, APD patrol cars, finally arrived at the Rodriguez's modest Grove Park apartment, the mood was even more tense. What should have been a safe home was now a scene of intense fear. The first officers to arrive found no obvious signs of forced entry. No doors had been broken, no windows broken. No signs of violence or struggle. This, while seemingly good news, caused some officers to immediately turn their suspicions to the family. "Kids run away all the time in this neighborhood," a young officer whispered to a colleague, inadvertently expressing a deep-seated prejudice. Maria and her husband, Juan Rodriguez, desperately tried to recall every detail of the day, but fear clouded their minds. Detective Ethan Cole, an experienced APD investigator who had worked in diverse neighborhoods, arrived on the scene later. He felt a distinct unease at how the junior officers were handling the situation. There was a lack of urgency, a cold indifference in the air. As he tried to reassure Maria and Juan through a bilingual officer who had arrived late, he sensed their desperate and even their underlying fear. "We need you to tell us exactly what happened, from the time Michael left school until you found him missing," he said, trying to keep his voice as calm as possible. Maria, her eyes puffy and her hands shaking, could only repeat the story of Michael not coming home as usual. Juan stood by, head bowed, helpless, feeling the injustice weighing down on him. Meanwhile, in another world, dozens of miles north, in the affluent, peaceful suburban community of Roswell, Georgia, a similar tragedy unfolded. That same afternoon, on the 22nd of September, Eric Thompson, a 9-year-old white boy with blonde hair and blue eyes, also disappeared from his school. Eric Thompson's case triggered an immediate Amber Alert, blaring on every national radio and television station. Thousands of reporters descended on Roswell. Police helicopters hovered overhead, and hundreds of officers and specialized search teams were mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Top APD and FBI officials held back-to-back press conferences, pledging to use every resource to find the boy. Eric's photo was plastered across newscasts, social media, and digital billboards along every major thoroughfare. The hashtag number #FindEricThompson trended globally, drawing attention and prayers from around the world. The Thompson family's fear was deeply felt and shared across the country. People felt a sense of responsibility, empathy, and a desire to contribute to finding this white child. Their voices were heard, their pain was felt, and justice seemed to be on the horizon. The contrast could not have been more stark. For Michael Rodriguez of Grove Park, the apathy was palpable. The search was limited to the immediate area, with a small police presence and mostly local volunteers. Survey maps show pink lines marking areas that had been swept, but in Rodriguez's case, those lines were surprisingly sparse. Hundreds of hours of searching were done, but the results were startling. Nothing. No ribbons, no footprints, no sign of any children who had ever been there. It was as if Michael had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the silence of the neighborhood and the indifference of the authorities. Grove Park locals, the most ardent volunteers from the African American and Latino communities, reported that the official search teams never actually penetrated the dark alleys, dilapidated buildings, or abandoned areas of the community. The search boundary tape was visible only on major streets, near the safer areas. The deeper, more dangerous areas, where a frightened or injured child might reasonably hide, were left untouched. This raised a chilling question. Was the search more symbolic than strategic? Was the key terrain ever really thoroughly searched? Or was there some reason, some internal logic, that led investigators to ignore these areas, as if they knew Michael was not there? This omission was not just a mistake. It was a terrifying omission, leaving the public feeling helpless and angry, knowing that efforts that could have saved the boy's life had been wasted because prejudice had clouded their vision.
Meanwhile, in Greenwich, a media and police storm swept through the state following the disappearance of Eric and Chloe Jensen. The night of the 22nd of September, when the missing person report was filed, an Amber Alert was broadcast across the state of Connecticut. Every national news channel was on the scene, with reporters reporting live from the scene, helicopters hovering overhead, and hundreds of volunteers and police combing every square foot of land. Top officials from the Greenwich Police Department and the FBI held back-to-back press conferences, pledging to use every resource to find the children. Photos of Eric and Chloe were plastered across newscasts, social media, and digital billboards along every major thoroughfare. The hashtag number #FindEricandChloe trended globally, drawing attention and prayers from around the world. The Jensen family's fear was deeply felt and shared across the country. Everyone felt responsible, had empathy, and wanted to contribute to finding these white kids. Their voices were heard, their pain was felt, and justice seemed to be assured immediately. The contrast could not be more stark. For Michael Rodriguez of Grove Park, the indifference was palpable. The initial scientific evidence and witness testimony, if treated objectively, might have pointed in a different direction. However, they were ignored or misinterpreted due to obvious investigative bias. A prime example is the testimony of a witness, Maria Lopez, an elderly grandmother who lived across the street from the Rodriguez. Miss Lopez testified that she had seen an older model white van with a variety of strange stickers on its rear doors roaming the neighborhood that morning shortly before Michael disappeared. She reported it to the police immediately, insisting that the vehicle did not belong to anyone in the neighborhood. However, her testimony, given in Spanish and hastily translated, was unfortunately ignored. The police did not seriously pursue the truck, instead focusing on finding evidence linking David Perez. This lack of attention to detail, once again, left the public angry and frustrated, knowing that a vital clue had been missed. The psychological analysis of David Perez's behavior also revealed a contradiction between who he really was and the role that society, police, assigned him. The records showed that David was an impulsive, angry young man, but there was no sign of violence against children or of perverted tendencies. He had a troubled past, but there was nothing that suggested he was capable of committing a heinous crime like kidnapping. However, his records were reread in a biased light, turning small mistakes into horrific evidence of a mentally unstable person. The Latino and African American communities of Grove Park were filled with anger and frustration. They held rallies and protests outside the Atlanta Police Department, carrying signs demanding justice for Michael and the release of David Perez. They felt betrayed and abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect them. They feared not only that their children were missing, but that they themselves might be victims of discrimination. A cry for help rang out in the urban desert, but it seemed to be drowned out by the honking of horns and the indifferent silence of the law. There were informal reports from conscientious police insiders of internal dissent. Some younger officers, or those with experience working closely with diverse communities, expressed skepticism about the direction of the investigation. They felt that something was wrong, that they were missing important clues because they were too focused on a convenient target. But their voices were drowned out by the rigidity of their superiors and by the invisible but powerful outside pressure, perhaps coming from powerful sources who did not want the case to be complicated by racial factors. This indifference not only affected the case, but also had a profound impact on the community's psyche. Fear and distrust of the police grew. Parents were afraid to report even minor incidents for fear of being blamed or being treated unfairly. An invisible wall of suspicion and resentment was built between the community and law enforcement, allowing the real perpetrator to hide in the shadows, laugh at the system's failures, and continue to spread terror. This was a case where justice was not only challenged by the perpetrator, but also undermined by the very people who protected the law, because discrimination was ingrained in the core. Part 3. Whispers from the Dark, when the predator is in disguise and the truth is twisted. As the investigation into David Perez, the prejudicial suspect of convenience, slows down, a glimmer of truth begins to seep through the veil of prejudice and indifference. Amid the chaos of protests and the suspicious silence from the authorities, a few investigators, those who remain morally upright and principled, begin to notice the missing pieces, the overlooked details, like cold whispers from the darkness. Detective Rachel Davies, a veteran of the investigation, felt a growing unease about the direction the investigation was taking. She knew that focusing on David Perez, a young man who appeared to be socially inept but had no history of serious violence, was a waste of valuable time. She began to review the files, looking for anomalies that others had missed. Her eyes fell on a small report from an elderly woman, Maria Elena Lopez, who lived on the edge of Grove Park, near an abandoned park. She reported seeing an older white van with a strange sticker on the back door loitering in the area in the days before Michael's disappearance. In particular, on the morning of the 22nd of September, she had seen the van parked near the walkway leading to the park just before Michael disappeared. This was a lead about the white van that should have been immediately pursued, but was ignored by APD. Digging deeper, Detective Davies uncovered another chilling detail. A local street vendor, Jose Garcia, who often pushed a cart selling cornflakes and coffee on a nearby street corner, told police that he heard a small noise, like a rattle of metal, around the time Michael was supposed to have disappeared. He had thought it was just the clatter of trash in a nearby trash can, but after the disappearance, the sound haunted him. It wasn't a scream or a struggle, just a very small sound, almost insignificant, but it had an eerie, chilling feel to it. The perpetrator seemed to have acted with utmost professionalism and silence, like a passing ghost. It didn't fit the image of a random kidnapper or a botched robbery that led to panic. It suggested careful preparation, an eerie calm, the mark of a sick mind. While re-examining the evidence, the APD forensics team, under the direction of Detective Davies, focused on small, nearly invisible scratches found on the wooden gate behind the Rodriguez home. Initially, they were thought to have been made by plants or animals. However, after careful microscopic analysis, they showed signs of a sharp object, possibly a metal tool used to gently open or pry the gate open without making a loud noise. This, combined with the rattling sounds made by Mr. Jose, began to paint a picture of a planned intruder, a predator who acted not on instinct but according to a predetermined script. Here was the first haunting twist. The truth of the case was completely different. This was not a random abduction or accident, but a targeted crime, carried out by someone with terrifying preparation and control. As these tiny pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Detective Davies noticed a disturbing pattern: the lack of evidence of violence. No screams, no signs of a struggle. Michael's room was left tidy, as if he had never woken up. This led to a chilling deduction. If Michael had been taken, he had been taken by someone he did not fear, or someone who could easily overpower him without putting up any resistance. This opened the door to a psychological analysis of a potential perpetrator's behavior. This could be a psychopath, someone who was able to present a normal face to society, but who was hiding a twisted soul. Could we be dealing with a psychopath, a silent killer who had been living among the community, completely unsuspected, exploiting the chaos and division that the system had created? The whispers from the dark become clearer, not in words, but in actions. The lack of evidence is the strongest evidence. The killer leaves no trace because he is calculated, because he knows how to act silently, taking advantage of the chaos and prejudice of society. Detective Davies begins to imagine another person, a ghost that makes no sound, no clear shape, but is capable of spreading absolute terror. She knows that to catch this person, they must think differently, must see through the prejudice and indifference of the very system she serves. The anger and frustration of the community was palpable. They had been ignored, their children abandoned, and now the chilling truth was emerging about a hidden predator exploiting those same vulnerabilities. The sense of helplessness, knowing that those who were supposed to protect them were not doing enough, and that a dangerous person was at large, was a constant haunt for the people of Grove Park. Part 4: Exposing the Face of Hate, the crime of racist and evidence from hell. As the fog of suspicion and prejudice slowly lifts, a truth more horrifying than your worst nightmares begins to emerge. This is not just a kidnapping or an ordinary crime. This is a hideous display of hatred, a racist crime hidden in the shadows of indifference and social injustice. Detective Rachel Davies, after days of relentless work, found a disturbing match. The white, older model van with the strange decals that witnesses had described had finally been located. It belonged to a man named Arthur Albright, 50, lived in a posh suburb of Greenwich, Connecticut, a stark contrast to the poverty of Newark and Grove Park. Arthur Albright was an early retired electrical engineer who had lived a seemingly exemplary life, regularly participated in community activities, and was respected by his neighbors. He was a white, soft-spoken man, and no one would have guessed that someone like him could harbor such a twisted soul. The initial twist was revealed. The killer was an unlikely person, someone above suspicion, someone who should have been protected by his status and race, a model teacher. As investigators dug deeper into Arthur Albright, they discovered a horrifying truth. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement of his home was a secret room stocked with surveillance equipment, detailed maps of Newark and other heavily immigrant neighborhoods, and a wealth of white supremacist literature. He had been monitoring those neighborhoods for months, studying the habits of immigrant families, especially those with young children. He viewed these communities as unclean, a threat to white civilization, a perverted ideology fostered by anonymous online extremist groups. The scientific evidence began to reveal the true face of the crime. Careful forensic analysis found tiny blue and pink fibers, matching the clothes Sarah and David had worn the day they disappeared, stuck in the door of Albright's truck. And a tiny DNA sample, found under David's fingernails, a trace of a desperate struggle, however small, matched Albright's profile in a national database from a minor public order incident years earlier. It was irrefutable evidence, a biomarker of horror that might have been caught sooner if not for bias in the handling of the case. Witness testimony, previously ignored or not listened to properly by the police, was now invaluable. Maria Lopez, the elderly woman who had seen the white van, was re-interviewed. With the encouragement of Detective Davies, she went into more detail about how Albright frequently stopped near the park, sometimes pretending to repair the vehicle, sometimes simply observing. Another witness, a 12-year-old boy named Mateo Rodriguez, who often played soccer at the abandoned park, gave a chilling account. A few weeks before the disappearance, he had seen Albright approach Sarah and David as they played near the footpath. He had offered them candy, spoken to them in broken Spanish, and tried to entice them to come closer to his van. Mateo became alarmed and pulled the two children away, but he was too scared to tell anyone. The boy's fear, a fear born of being an immigrant in a neighborhood neglected by the police, kept him silent. Now, his voice, belatedly, has become a living testimony to the perversion of the perpetrator, a testimony to the injustice that runs deep. Arthur Albright's analysis of his criminal behavior paints a chilling picture of a psychopath. On the surface, he was a model citizen, a decent neighbor, a respected member of the wealthy white community, and a dedicated teacher. But on the inside, he was a monster driven by racial hatred and a perverted belief that he was purifying society. He was not insane in the conventional sense. He was a calculating, cold man, able to conceal his true nature perfectly. He displayed terrifying control over himself, committing his crimes silently, leaving no obvious traces of violence, like a professional predator. This explains why the initial crime scene showed no signs of a struggle. Albright had subdued Sarah and David in some sophisticated way, perhaps with sweet talk or surprise, before taking them away quickly and quietly. He didn't want to make any noise, didn't want to attract attention. That silence was his signature. The horror factor was raised to a new level when investigators found a hidden diary of Albright's5.com. In it, he recorded in detail his surveillance plans, his sick thoughts about racial pollution, and his achievements. He also described how he cleaned each area, each seed of impurity, along with secret photos of immigrant families. Those pages were more than evidence. They were a horrifying confession, revealing a deeply twisted soul, one who targeted innocent children because of their skin color, because of their origin. The cold, meticulous lines describing his actions made the reader shudder, haunted by the cruelty hidden behind his normal appearance. Anger and horror spread like wildfire. The Newark community, and indeed the entire country, exploded in outrage as the true nature of the crime was revealed. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was a hate crime, a direct challenge to society's core values. Frustration that the system had been slow, that it had ignored the early cries for help, that it had allowed someone like Arthur Albright to roam free in the shadow of prejudice, now morphed into a furious fire, demanding justice not just for Sarah and David, but for all the other forgotten victims who had paid the price because of the color of their skin. Part 5. The Steel Wall of the System. Justice buried by prejudice and inconscience. As the true nature of the crime is revealed, a horrific crime fueled by racist hatred, the focus inevitably turns to the flaws in the legal system itself. How could someone like Frederick Albright have operated in the shadows for so long? Why were the family's initial cries for help ignored? This is not just the story of a twisted killer, but also an indictment of systemic injustice, where justice is delayed and buried under the mud of prejudice and indifference. The police inaction in the early hours after Sarah and David Miller disappeared has become an indelible stain. The initial 911 call, made in Spanish by a distraught mother, was not treated with the urgency it should have been. Instead of a rapid response team and a bilingual officer, the process was slow and cumbersome. The prime time to search for missing children the first 48 hours was wasted. The failure to issue an Amber Alert immediately, even though the case met the criteria, was a fatal mistake. It deprived millions of public eyes of a valuable opportunity to search for Albright's white van or identify him earlier. It was a clear example of the unequal distribution of resources, a problem that is acute in minority communities. The neglect was also evident in the protection of the crime scene. When the first officers arrived, the area around the house was not properly cordoned off. Neighbors and friends, in their efforts to help, inadvertently disturbed the scene, damaging or destroying important forensic evidence that could have linked Albright to the case earlier. Although Detective Davies attempted to correct this mistake later, it was too late to fully restore the integrity of the scene. Language and cultural barriers played a pernicious role in hampering the investigation. The Miller family, with limited English, struggled to fully convey their fears and important details. Their statements, such as Elena Ramirez seeing a white van or Jose Rivera hearing a clicking sound, were initially dismissed or not taken seriously by officers inexperienced in working with immigrant communities. The community's distrust of the police, stemming from a long history of discrimination and unfairness, also made many potential witnesses reluctant to speak up. They feared being labeled a suspect, deported, or simply ignored. This silence, again, was the price of prejudice. The investigation was seriously misdirected by focusing on Carl Ramirez, a young Latino with a low profile. This not only wasted resources, but also reinforced racial stereotypes. Instead of following up on real leads, the police followed a convenient script that turned Carl into a scapegoat in the eyes of the public. Although Carl was later exonerated, the scars of his wrongful conviction remain, a painful reminder of how bias can distort justice. The delay in classifying the case as a criminal case was also a fatal flaw. For weeks, Sarah and David's case was treated as a routine missing persons case, despite signs that something more sinister had occurred. The delay gave Albright time to cover his tracks, to remain in the shadows, making it much harder to gather evidence. Public anger and frustration continued to mount. Protests continued outside Newark Police Department headquarters, demanding transparency and justice for Sarah and David. Immigrant rights and racial justice groups spoke out loudly, calling out the system's failures and demanding a fairer investigation. They felt a deep sense of frustration that children's lives had been put in the balance by bias and incompetence. The truth was, a racist murderer had committed the crime, but did the system have the capacity or the integrity to confront its own failures and ensure that justice was served? This was a haunting question, not just for the Miller family, but for all Americans who followed the case. Part 6. Echoes of Innocence and Justice in the Dark. The Haunting End. As the curtain is lifted on Frederick Albright's hate crimes, the fate of Sarah and David Miller remains a big question mark, a lingering obsession not only for the family, but for the entire community. However, in the darkness of the unsolved mystery, another chilling twist begins to unfold, turning all speculation upside down and exposing the terrifying nature of the perpetrator's multiple personalities, along with the ultimate weakness of the system. Detective Rachel Davies, despite having caught Albright, still felt that something was wrong. The investigation had been too easy after he had been identified. Details such as Albright's constant loitering around the neighborhood, the way he concealed his secret room, and his use of subtle signs to lure children in, all suggested a chillingly meticulous preparation. But one question haunted Davies. Why did he leave such small but traceable traces? Could someone as cold and calculating as him be so careless? Detective Davies couldn't sleep that night. She returned to the file room, reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, every detail. She stopped at the tamale seller Jose Rivera's account of the rattling of metal. And then she remembered a small detail overlooked in Frederick Albright's personal file. He had been an amateur watchmaker, known for his meticulousness and passion for intricate metalwork. A chilling thought flashed through Davies' mind. He wasn't being reckless. He wanted to be found. He wanted his message exposed. The final, most chilling twist is the true nature of Fritz Albright. He was not just a racist extremist. Further psychological analysis, along with new evidence from interviews with people who knew him, revealed that Albright suffered from dissociative identity disorder, DID severe, a rare but extremely dangerous form of perversion. He has another personality, a dark passenger, which he calls the architect. This personality is the real mastermind of the case, who not only wants to cleanse the community, but also wants to prove his superiority by committing a perfect crime, leaving no trace, and then, in a sophisticated way, revealing the smallest clues, enough for common predators like the police to find. The architect wants to be recognized, wants the whole world to be horrified by his work. He not only kidnapped Sarah and David, he manipulated the entire investigation, played with law enforcement, exposed their hidden prejudices. This multiple personality was not discovered early because the Frederick Albright personality on the outside was too perfect, too normal, completely hiding the monster inside. This is a psychological horror twist, making the listener realize that evil can be lurking right next to us in perfect form. The fate of Sarah and David Miller, tragic as it was, revealed the full truth about hate crimes and systemic negligence. Acting on clues left by the architect, the police found an old, forgotten bunker under an abandoned house a few miles from Miller Street. Inside, Sarah and David were found dead. They had been held in the worst conditions, and their deaths were a heartbreaking result of neglect. Autopsies revealed that they had died from malnutrition and shock, not direct violence. This detail added to the anger and frustration. The children had not died from murder, but from neglect, forgotten in the police delays and racism that paralyzed the investigation. Even their deaths were an indictment of society. The case of Sarah and David Miller is more than just a personal tragedy. It is a mirror of the flaws and failures of our justice system. From the delays in initial response, to the bias in the investigation, to the disregard of witnesses and evidence due to language barriers and racial bias, the underlying message of the story is painfully clear. The justice system fails to protect children, especially those from minority communities, when fairness is ignored. The public's anger and helplessness still smolders, haunted by the question, how many more Sarahs and Davids are being lost in the darkness of prejudice? The frustration of not being able to help innocent children because of the system's delays will haunt us forever. We have followed the journey of Sarah and David Miller in their quest for justice. We have witnessed the failure of a family, the failure of a system, and the perversion of a perpetrator. Our story does not end with a redemption arc or an easy answer. Instead, it ends with a call to action. A call to listen to the voices that have been ignored to tear down the barriers of prejudice, and to demand a justice system that is truly fair to all, regardless of skin color or background. Sarah and David are gone, but their story will forever be a haunting echo, a chilling reminder that darkness not only exists in the hearts of evil, but can also cloud the institutions we trust. Let this echo of buried innocence and justice spur us to action, so that no other child has to pay the price for the world's indifference. Who is the real evil? The one who exploits the vulnerabilities of the system to wreak terror, or the system that enables him?